All right, I gather we're recording. So, oh boy, I think we are. Oh well, I hope we are.
There's a red button flashing somewhere.
Okay, good. That means it must be doing its thing. Okay. Anyways, I guess we should start this
So
off.
and you probably want about half an hour?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Why don't we go sort of from back to front? We'll be really strange here. And can you tell me about the what the heck this is with ISIS showing up there and what's happening? I guess what I'm interested in is how the heck are the Taliban going to appreciate that?
The Taliban have got a problem with ISIS
Yeah.
because they have got their own Amir al-Mu'mineen, their own commander of all the faithful, as Mullah Omar declared himself in 1994, at the head of the leader of all Muslims, effectively.
Yeah.
And when Baghdadi declared himself the leader of all Muslims and declared this caliphate, there was quite a lot of concern here because and insults flowed between the two since then. And the first and only named commander we've actually had in Afghanistan, Mullah Rauf, who was killed by a drone strike earlier this week, he was someone who had, or he was named by ISIS as their commander, deputy commander in the region, and his troops have been fighting with the Taliban since they set themselves up in January. Afghan generals I spoke to in Helmand when I was there 2 or 3 weeks ago said that Mullah Rauf was an ex-Taliban commander, someone who'd fallen out with the Taliban and saw his opportunity with this new organization. Now, whether or not he was actually directed from Syria, or whether he was an opportunist who the Syrian ISIS said, in order to show how big and grand they were with tentacles
Hmm.
across the planet, that they said he was their chosen person. We don't know, and analysts here are scratching their heads as to whether the accounts of black flags in many places in Afghanistan are just local opportunists who are having a go. They're individuals like the individuals in Paris who
Right.
one of them was found with an ISIS flag, but I mean he was a sympathizer. He wasn't directed by them. And whether that's the same thing that's going on here, or whether there is really a concerted effort by ISIS to spread into Afghanistan, is a really interesting question. There's a disturbing factor in this, which is that there is an ancient myth which Muslims like to quote, which is that when black flags fly in Khorasan, which is a mythic ancient name for the region that Afghanistan is part of, when black flags fly again in Khorasan, then that is one of the signs before the end of the world. So when the ISIS in Syria declared that this character Rauf was their deputy commander, and a man called Saeed Khan, who's a former Taliban spokesman in Pakistan, was their commander in the region of Khorasan, then people kind of pricked up their ears and said, what's going on here? They're clearly trying to ring mythic bells, and whether that will work, of course, is a big worry for the Afghan government, which is already facing a conflict against the Taliban and doesn't want a war on another front.
Yeah. So I picked that up in your BBC online article. Yeah, that I found that interesting too. The reference to Khorasan, if they're who's trying to play that. That's ISIS is trying to play that one.
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
Although there's a really curious sidebar to this, which is the first reference that anyone heard of Khorasan in this whole conflict recently was when the Americans dropped a missile last September on a compound in northern Syria, and they said they had killed some senior commanders from a group previously unnamed, which was the Khorasan group. So the actual first reference to Khorasan comes from the United States intelligence sources, and exactly why they chose to do that. I mean, analysts at the time said There isn't a Khorasan group. We haven't heard of one, although people know what the name means, because it is this ancient mythic name for the region, including Afghanistan. I guess it's a name a little bit like Albion for England. It's that sort of it rings some sort of mythic bell.
Mm-hmm. Now, when we consider this potential, as you say, we don't know if these are opportunists or people who've had a falling out with the Taliban. Who knows? How are they getting their money then? Are they being paid better than the Taliban, or who is?
They're not. They're not a serious insurgency threat at this stage.
Yeah.
We're talking about a few people, with weapons, which they've got already. We're talking about. There've been accounts in a number of places in the country, and it's disaffected Taliban individuals, and there is no sign of any kind of concerted assault by them. They haven't carried out any. They haven't made any demands. They haven't carried out any major attacks.
Okay, all right. Well, let's start stepping backwards then. What we were talking about before with concern to obviously this. If this expands, this affects the security picture in Afghanistan, and you were telling me before about the security picture there now, which is basically the 10,000 man force left by the United States can pretty much look after itself, but it can't do much else, which of course leaves, as you said, large swaths of the country in control of the Taliban.
Yeah, I think the security is a mixed picture. There are 10,000 US troops and some 5,000 or so other international troops, mainly Turkish, whose job it is not to fight combat. It is to train Afghan troops and to provide some sort of security presence, including security presence for airplanes. And we do hear warplanes going over every night, and there are clearly drones and NATO planes. The attack on Rauf, this so-called ISIS commander, was the second attack that we've known about since the beginning of January. So they're fairly rare. They're much rarer than they were. But there is the ability of Afghan forces to call in airstrikes when they want to. That's the only combat capability that the international forces have left here. But the Afghan forces are pretty good. There are 350,000 now. They have problems with recruitment. They have problems with a churn of people. But there's no problem with motivation of the people who are there. And when I've been out with them, which is a couple of times over the last couple of years, they are well trained. They use GPS. They call in mortars. They map read. All of these things which the Afghan army couldn't do until quite recently. So I think the trainers who set up this force are surprised by the quality of it. And even the much derided police have held their own during some pretty tough fighting in Helmand province in particular towards the end of last summer, when the Taliban made a big effort to move further south from the areas in the north of the province, which they do control, but where nobody lives. And so I think that's the general picture across the country, where you see the populated zones, certainly the cities, Mazar in the north, Herat in the west, Jalalabad in the east, and Kabul itself, and Kandahar, even Kandahar in the south, far more stable than they were. The populated zone of Helmand province, stable, where people live. There are better roads, schools, clinics, and government beginning to operate. And there aren't poppies grown there, but Helmand province grows almost all of the poppies grown in the world in an area outside the centrally populated zone. So you're seeing the conflict and indeed the sort of banditry, etc., pushed, as it were, out of the main population centres. And an intriguing UN report this week going through the details of exactly how the Taliban are supported increasingly by criminal activities, by narcotics and other activities, and mining and illegal forestry and these kinds of things. So you're seeing the Taliban degenerating, as many insurgent groups have around the world, from a sort of idealistic revolutionary movement into a crime mafia, which is supporting itself with some pretty awful activities, and probably has less support from the international community, but doesn't need it because the crime works so well. So you're seeing an insurgency which has changed radically. Of course, one of the issues around the support of the Taliban by crime is that there are many individuals who are close to the government and who are members of parliament who also have links with crime networks. So you're seeing the central state finding it quite difficult to operate in these circumstances.
This brings a couple of its own questions. Then, how would this new direction, the radical departure, as you put it, of how the Taliban supports itself, how would that square with the religious sensibilities and leadership of Mullah Omar and his Quetta?
Well, the Taliban, over the years, the Taliban leadership, when I talked to them in the 1990s and more recently, will always say very clearly that they're against poppy growing, but they've come to an accommodation on that. I mean, there's a war going on, and they're not smoking it themselves, and they see no problem with causing problems for the infidels outside the country. So I think that there is, but I mean, ultimately they have the aim that were they to retake the country, they would stand up against it. But I mean, I don't think anyone expects the Taliban to retake Afghanistan now. If the international community continue to pay $5.1 billion US a year, which is a lot of money for the Afghan forces, and if that goes on, if Congress, and it is mostly American money, continue to raise that money, then I think the Afghan forces will be able to prevent the Taliban from retaking the country. They are no longer an existential threat to Afghanistan. The new President Ghani has played a good foreign policy. He hasn't done much domestically yet, but since he came in towards the end of last year, he's visited Pakistan, he's visited Turkmenistan, China, most of Afghanistan's key neighbors, intriguingly not India, which again is sending the right signals to Pakistan, who he is really keen to bring on side. And there have been intelligence benefits from that. Some of the alleged attackers of the Peshawar school attack were arrested in Afghanistan by Afghan security forces because of this improved cooperation. The shelling in Kunar province in the east, which was going on last year from Pakistan, has stopped. Soldiers, both Afghan and international, tell me that relations between the soldiers on both sides are much better than they were. So you're seeing, so many of the kinds of mood music in terms of security across Afghanistan moving in the right direction. Now, that doesn't mean that there isn't, a really serious security threat continuing to many people in the country, from the northeast in particular, in Helmand in the south, in places where there are poppies, and that's going to continue to be a major threat. And this spring and summer, of course, is the first test of the new democratic government without international combat forces on the ground. They fought last year without much support, but at least they had them in the background, and now they've got far fewer international troops in the background and will face, I think, a huge challenge as the Taliban try and regain some of the initiative that I think that they've lost.
Right. Interesting you brought up that issue of making sure that the money gets through to the Afghan government, because I recall talking to some Canadian soldiers back in 2006 who were working with, it was either ANA or the police at the time, AMP, and pay had become such an issue that at one meeting where the payroll was supposed to come through, the guys who were supposed to deliver it had so much shaken down. By the time they delivered it, the guys who they were supposed to deliver it to thought they had stolen it, and a gunfight broke out between all these policemen.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. There are some really simple mechanisms that can be operated on that. It's been a real cause of friction between the new government and the UN, because, believe it or not, the UN actually are the people who run the payroll for the Afghan police through a mechanism called LOTFA, the Law and Order Trust Fund, and nobody knows. I mean, there's been a lot of critical comments made from outside the UN. Nobody knows how many police there really are, because of course the payrolls are inflated by commanders who say we have this number of police. But there are mechanisms being worked on at the moment to try and improve that. I mean, one of the most basic things they're doing is to advertise what the salary is of a policeman and of a soldier, so at least they know how much they should be getting, because many of them are just get what's been being given to them, and what is, you know, the small amount that filters down through the corruption in the mechanism. Now, this has been an appalling problem for the security forces in Afghanistan for some years.
Yeah. Now, if we go back, based on something you just said a few minutes ago, the shape of the insurgency there. If we go back and compare it to, let's say, something we talked about before, Malaya or Kenya, you wouldn't say this is a broken insurgency. It's one that's been pushed out of the mainstream. How would you categorize it compared to?
You haven't seen the concerted effort you saw in either of those countries to really regain the initiative, and certainly. I mean, I think there are two aspects to the insurgency. The Taliban are still clearly a significant threat. There are still a lot of people in Pakistan who would like to see them win, although the Pakistani intelligence services and the army genuinely appear to have changed their mind now, and they no longer talk about the strategic need to have, you know, a backdoor in Afghanistan as they used to. Strategic depth was the policy. That seems no longer to be Pakistani military doctrine, and that's taken some of the pressure off. It means that they don't feel that they need to have a client in Afghanistan in quite the same way that they did. So I think the Taliban, though, do remain, as we were saying, a really significant potential threat to to stabilizing properly and delivering government right across the country. And the efforts that are being made to deal with that are firstly military, and the Afghan military, are fighting the Taliban. Every time you come back from the south, in particular, on a civilian flight, there are coffins of the fallen on the plane, and sometimes they get saluted on, and sometimes they're just, if there happen to be senior officers there when I've been on those planes, and sometimes they just come on with the baggage, and it's a pretty somber reminder to people of the cost of the war, which is very large to Afghan forces, but it's also very large to Afghan civilians. The International Committee of the Red Cross put out a report this week saying this year was the largest number of civilian casualties since 2001. So the fighting is, quite bad in the places where it happens. Now, one of the reasons for the increased casualties is that Afghan forces kill lower tolerance, as it were, for civilian casualties. I mean, they in the way that international troops, genuinely don't target civilians, they might spray more bullets into a village than American or British forces did, so Canadian forces. So that's one of the reasons for the high casualties. It doesn't necessarily mean the war's got worse. But as well as the Taliban war, there is also this banditry, which is now becoming a much more complex operation. I mean, a police chief who I've got to know very well in one of the provinces in the northeast, I mean, he's been a friend of mine over a number of years in different jobs. And I spent a few days with him 2 or 3 months ago, and he said, I'm fighting in all districts of my province. All 10 districts of the province of Baghlan, we're fighting. But in only 2 of them, we're fighting against somebody you could call the Taliban. In the other 8 districts, we're fighting against criminal elements, people allied to the old militias. And he's quite an imaginative commander. He, failing to get the kind of heavy weaponry he needed from the center, he went into villages and bought old rocket launchers and kit that people had left over from the Mujahideen war, and I mean, welded on top of an American-issued Humvee is a mortar launcher with the date 1980 on the base plate. So this is a piece of equipment. It's been in the Afghan. It's a Russian mortar launcher. It's been in the Afghan war for since the Russians came. So there are some he is a police officer, and he's having to use mortars in order to do law and order in his province, and that's not only 20% of what he's facing is the Taliban, and I think that's increasingly true in a lot of parts of the country, which means that counterinsurgency, in the sense of actually getting alongside a political enemy who you can deal with, is a far more complex thing to do. It is happening. President Ghani is talking to the Taliban. There's a Chinese peace track with the Taliban. There are genuine talks now going on. We won't hear about them, which means that they really are going on. And there's been so much public talk about talks not happening in recent years. But from everything I'm hearing from people who really know about this, there are the first real efforts at reconciliation with the Taliban since 2001, honestly, which are now happening. So, that's part of what's going on at the same time as trying to prove to them that they won't win on the battlefield. But then there is this other whole security issue which Afghanistan is going to have to face up to, and it's going to have to deal with that by ending corruption. And I mean, I think the biggest challenge the country faces is a rentier political class who have become fat on foreign aid, which is too much of it's gone into their pockets rather than into the mouths of the hungry. And those individuals in various positions of influence in the provinces and indeed in Parliament itself are squatting on the problems, squatting on the ability of the country to get itself out of the problems that it's in. There doesn't seem to be any sense of urgency, for example, in endorsing cabinet ministers. So we don't yet have a full cabinet. Only 1/3 of the ministers who this alliance of Dr. Abdullah and President Ghani put together, with this sort of a slightly uncomfortable alliance at the top of the government between a president and his defeated opponent who sits alongside him as the so-called CEO of the government. Only 1/3 of their ministers were approved by Parliament, which then promptly went off for a 2-month holiday and doesn't come back until the end of March, when they'll look at new appointments. Now, the end of March is nearly a year since the last election, so effective government in a country where it really matters to have an independent civil service, a competent. It really matters who the head man or woman is in a ministry, and that seems to me like a negligence on a grand scale, really, from a political class that frankly should know better.
It's funny, David. As you were talking, I was thinking about that famous old French adage that the more things change, the more they remain the same. I was thinking about some of this sounds like back in the Parsham and Kalki days, just before the Soviets came in, where you're talking of this rentier class. Well, they had that in the form of the Marxists who couldn't give it. In fact, they were doing everything they could to annoy the countryside. They weren't doing what they should have been doing, but they were taking the foreign largesse, at least in this sense. It was from the Soviets, which probably wasn't as large as the largesse as you might get.
I think that's right. I mean, I think I think that you're right. Although the worst corruption has been since 2001 because so much money has come in.
Right.
Look, it's not all disastrous. A good report, interesting report from Chatham House last year, written by an ex-World Bank economist who knows this country better than most, who was here for several years in the early years after 2001 and was at the time very critical of the way international money was spent. But he brought out a report saying that actually the quite ambitious development targets of the Bonn summit in 2002 have mostly been met. Growth has averaged around 9%. Schools have been built. There are 10 million children in school, whatever the figure the government comes up with. But there are many millions of children in school. Now, too many girls leave too young. But many millions, an average of 42% of school children are girls across the country. And roads are better than they were. And, the economy hasn't completely tanked. The currency, it costs a lot to keep it there, but the currency has been stable. So although business confidence is flatlining since the election, and that's one of the big problems that this long delay and sort of sense of paralysis around actual government and real growing sense of concern about the potential for the war to break out, and a president who doesn't make very comforting speeches to his people. He's not a kind of Reagan figure who makes people feel good about being Afghan. So despite all those challenges, actually, it's not all been disastrous, and some of the money, so much money was spent here. A lot of it was very negative in its effect, but some of that aid money did actually, as it were, fall on healthy ground, and some good plants have grown up among all the stones and thistles and all the other things that have happened along the way.
A couple of things sprung to mind when you were talking about this other element too of the criminal element of the insurgency. That seems to have always been a bit of an element in all fighting in Afghanistan. I was just thinking back to when the Americans had their bases like Restrepo out in Kunar, off of Kunar there, and the idea seemed to have been to be a block to stop folks coming in or going across the border into I guess what used to be the Momand area of northwest frontier of Pakistan. And it acted more like a magnet, and they were getting elements coming at them that weren't Taliban. That there were other groups coming at them and shooting things up. And I was just thinking about that issue quite a bit. How do you ever settle that down? It seems to me it's just part of the nature there.
Well. Providing security and stability at the center and opportunities. I was in that area about 18 months ago with Afghan forces chasing the Taliban, and good Afghan forces chasing the Taliban well. And when we go into those villages, similar to the ones illustrated in the Restrepo film, right on the frontier, and a group and a rather good Pashtun-speaking major. Held a little mini shura, and these men came up from the village and talked, and talking to these men, not a single one of them had been to school, not a single one, men in their between 30 and 50, I guess, not a single one, when you asked them, had any contact with the Afghan state at all. They went across the frontier to Pakistan for healthcare, and they didn't have any goods that they were selling into Afghanistan. They were pretty well subsistence farmers right up on the frontier. And the issue is, what does the Afghan state, got to do for them? It's got to provide, security and stability and cross-border security so that they don't get, fought between one side and another. Their question for the Afghan army who'd come was, it's fine that you're here, and that the Afghan army were proudly showing a Taliban flag that they'd taken down from one of the houses. They pushed the Taliban out. The Taliban were here last night, you're here this afternoon. Are you going to be staying? Are you going to provide us with security? We don't mind who provides us with security, but when the Taliban come back in, they're going to give us trouble because we've been talking to you. And that was, the guy didn't have an answer to that, because no, they weren't. They were coming back to the kind of forward operating tea shop, as it were, where we'd been sleeping for a few nights after they'd secured the end of this valley. And their job was not to remain on the ground and garrison it. It was to, defeat the Taliban when they were coming in. So, there is a huge problem with those areas. But the British fought for 100 years. Their toughest fighting across the whole of South Asia was in that very place, and they couldn't, they couldn't pacify it. In the end, they drew a line down it. That didn't help really, because they only divided people, and that line was supposed to pacify the Waziris. Where are things now? But the Pakistani forces do appear to have fought in that region. For the first time, North and South Waziristan have had major Pakistani army offensives in the last 2 years, and increasingly, there are reports of Arabs and their families who've been pushed out from North Waziristan, the place they've been living for many years, now pushed into Afghanistan because they can't live there any longer. So it's changing quite rapidly in that area, even in the frontier region. But it remains the biggest security challenge. And any government on either side that believes that it's going to sort of secure the border and hold its people and all of this, it's just fantasy. Because there are so many mountain passes that the people who live there know that there are Ghilzais, wandering nomads who there are Kuchis, wandering nomads who go among the Ghilzais in the mountains and who have been doing so for centuries and don't recognise the Durand Line. There are major tribal estates that straddle the border. The long-term answer is the European answer. It's taking the borders down because you have free trade and security. But I think we're a little bit away from that yet.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. Yeah, the recognition of Mortimer Durand's line has never really been there amongst the locals. They had their winter pasture and their summer pasture, and if the English or whoever want to put a line there, that's up to them, but makes no difference to them, to the locals. Okay, well, we'll step back a little bit further if we've still got time here, a little bit, and talk about where are some of the big names of former insurgency and Afghan intrigue now, such as Dostum and Haqqani and our old pal Hekmati.
Well, I started reporting here in 1994, and if anyone had told me that in 2015 we'd still be talking about Hekmatyar and Haqqani and Dostum and all, I became, as anyone traveling here in the 90s was before the Taliban, a kind of, you become an expert in all these, splits, these movements and splits in movements and who these people are. Well, going through them one by one in the ones that you named there. So, Abdul Rashid Dostum, who was a Russian commander and then changed sides more times than anyone in the 1990s. But actually, I have some admiration for his tactics, but not maybe for his human rights record. But he successfully prevented a shell falling on Mazar-e-Sharif throughout the Russian war. By being a Russian soldier, and then when the Russians looked like they were leaving, he joined the Mujahideen at just the key moment. And so Mazar-e-Sharif, before the Taliban arrived in '97, was completely out of the war. And I think Dostum is remembered gratefully by people up there for that. But he then reinvented himself as a businessman after 2001, and he's now the vice president, would you believe? And President Ghani chose him because he desperately needed name recognition in the north. And I went to political rallies where people had come to see Dostum and said, but who's the other guy? Well, the other guy was the one running for president. So, it worked. He got the votes he needed. And Dostum is now the first vice president and pushing his weight around, he appealed recently. He said, you're not defeating the Taliban with this ANA you've set up. Give me 20,000 troops and I'll sort it out for you in the north. Effectively asking for government support for his own militia again. No, he remains a very significant player. Hekmatyar, you mentioned, Taliban commander, a Mujahideen commander in the 1980s, became hugely wealthy in the 1980s and early 1990s. Ruthless individual, a man, fond of killing Western journalists during that time and radicalizing the refugee camps. Remember that Islamicization didn't begin with the Taliban; it began with Hekmatyar and indeed Massoud and his people, who were keen on a conservative view of Islam in Afghanistan. And he's still there. No one's seen him recently, but he remains a key commander, allied to the Taliban. His Hezb-e Islami party also has a vice president in the government. But that's the political wing that's quite a long way from the military wing, as it were. It's not like the IRA and Sinn Féin, who were pretty closely allied. There is a Hezbollah Islami political wing, which is not allied to the Taliban in the same way as he is. But as far as we know, he's still alive, and as far as we know, his fighters are fighting alongside the Taliban, and it's an extraordinary record for a guerrilla commander. Haqqani, still alive. His son is now the key commander, but he was again another Taliban figure. He was prominent in North Waziristan, and who knows what's happened to his troops. That's where he carried out most of his attacks into Afghanistan from. And then the one you didn't mention, but Mullah Omar, who of course was a Taliban, was a Mujahideen fighter and the founding father of the Taliban, and he remains the leader of the Taliban. Everyone you talk to who's connected with them say that he still takes decisions and he writes letters. And there've been reports and rumours that maybe he died because he hasn't been seen for a while. But I spoke to somebody a couple of weeks ago who said that he'd spent some time with him last winter. So he's very much around. He's in Pakistan, finding it more difficult to operate because of the churn there's quite a move against Afghans in Pakistan, and of course he doesn't really know which way to turn. And there are, of course, given all the criminality we were talking about before, there are genuine challenges to Mullah Omar's dominance of the Taliban now, I think for the first time. And there are clearly many different groups that sort of say they speak for it. But if you talk to Taliban people in Afghanistan, they all still defer to him as their leader.
I wanted to ask you, it would seem, again, going back to what we talked about before, this criminality that's going on, it would seem to fly in the face of what Omar stands for, because he first got going against the local warlords fighters doing criminal acts.
Well, it's an irony. But it is clearly, absolutely, that's where he emerged as sort of pure Pashtun revolution. And who knows what he feels about, I'd love to read him the UN report detailing the way that the Taliban, has these firm links to criminal elements, and particularly in the poppy trade. But it's I think that their argument would be it's a corrupt country. They certainly successfully stopped corruption when they were in power. Yeah. But that's corruption has returned, and they who knows? I mean, that's the great interview. One would I would very much. I met him briefly once in Kandahar. I think I'm one of the very few Westerners who's ever set eyes on him. But and I wouldn't, to describe it as an interview would be unreasonable. But it would be fascinating to sit down with him.
Yeah. No, just thinking about how quickly the Afghan Taliban refuted the Pakistani Taliban when they murdered those school children. I was wondering if he had a hand in that, because that sounded more like the old Taliban of Mullah Omar's that would stand up against that sort of thing.
Yes, I think that's right, and certainly he, in his his annual messages, he occasionally sort of reminds people of the need not to kill civilians, etc. But actually, there've been some pretty awful attacks in Afghanistan this year, including one at a volleyball game in Afghanistan, which don't feel like any of civilian restraints. And of course, I mean, the fact is that most civilians that get killed are killed by the Taliban. They're killed in whether they aim to kill them or not. I mean, their track record in delivery on his desire not to kill civilians is pretty bad. And increasingly, in the places where they're best known, in Kandahar and Helmand, opinion polls show that they're least popular. And part of that is because of the violence and kind of intimidation and these kinds of things. So I think the days when they were seen as a genuine reaction to corruption maybe passing, but justice and law enforcement are pretty corrupt in the villages, partly for reasons that we were describing before. If the police are not well paid, then they're going to shake money out of people.
Right.
And justice has to be paid for, and Taliban justice is free, and so that's been their calling card since 2001. That's how they became so much more successful again. And so, they're not without genuine backing in rural communities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it makes me wonder. So much of what you're saying could have been ameliorated, or at least tamped down, when we were talking about Kunar earlier. And if there'd been the organization in place to, your police chief friend there, to do the old anti-Mau Mau tactics, or the Malayan tactics of putting in the protected villages and hamlets where the people have a say in it themselves, and you have a police net that also, and medical services coming to these protected villages, that gives the government at least an imprint, that's more lasting than just occasionally the police chief can show up.
Yeah.
But it just seems that's almost a how shall we say, an ethereal thing that's just not developing, and
no.
It's just
no. I mean, a counterinsurgency of that sort has not been tried at the moment.
Yeah. It's ironic, David, because I did have a couple of students at American Military University, and they were training police, and actually there's a couple of special forces students of mine who deliberately set up a protected village and stuff, and it worked, but it was on a very small patch scale, so you didn't have the grid that you need, and it never really got anywhere. But it was kind of sad. They tried, and without that development, it's just it'll founder. But anyways, thinking back, I guess maybe we should just wrap this up with you. If you can tell us your first experiences with the Taliban back in 1996, and how you see the whole thing going now.
20 years of war.
In 5 minutes or less.
They were a genuinely unusual military force. They were willing to, and I saw this, they were willing to take a lot of casualties of their own. They fought ruthlessly in a way that often in Afghanistan forces have not fought. Up until then, a lot happened with negotiations, but they were willing to fight pitched battles. Their military commander in the mid-1990s was an outstanding strategist. His battle plan for taking Kabul, I mean, I was with him when he did it. He died in the assault on Sorobi, but I was with him the night before, and the Jane's military analysis of that was that it was a textbook three-pronged assault, and he pushed out Masood, the legendary commander who was holding on to Kabul and who ran up to Panjshir, and they were genuinely popular. You talked about their support from trucking organizations because they stopped the checkpoints on the roads. They emerged in response to banditry and appalling corruption during the Civil War years, and of course then failed to really deliver as a central government. They never really understood government. They didn't understand the need to talk to the outside world. And of course, as soon as once Osama bin Laden, who was already there, I mean, he'd been invited in by people before the Taliban. They'd never forget that.
Yeah.
And but as soon as he kind of began his assaults on the West, his attacks in 1998 in Africa, the embassy bombings in Africa, etc., and Clinton responded with cruise missiles, then they were kind of locked into this terrible dance of death with Al-Qaeda, who they never really had shared an agenda with. And I think that has very much changed. The young Taliban commanders now, some of them have been in Guantanamo Bay. Mullah Rauf had been in Guantanamo Bay, this man who was killed the other day as an IS commander. But there are Taliban now who are far more hardline and actually have a far more internationalist agenda than the Taliban did in the late 1990s. So it is a more dangerous
that is a change
for the outside world. It has changed. It remains at heart a group of people with a rather exceptional military, with a rather exceptional religious view. I mean, they have their own view on Islam, which is kind of quite slightly different to everybody else's in the world. Taliban exceptionalism in that is one feature of them, and they still have, as I was saying before, the support in the countryside because of the corruption that's there from the central government, and that's their main calling card, is providing local justice. But if at the same time they're taking money off trucking interests and logging interests and engaged in these criminal pursuits in an increasing way, then they lose the political credibility or their main recruiting tool, which is that they're the people who are operating against corruption. So I think what you're going to see this year is increasing nervousness around IS and ISIS, and whether that is going to come into Afghanistan, and pictures of black flags and scary videos of men on horseback carrying knives and all these kinds of things, which is there for the stock in trade. And we've already seen some of that in Pakistan with Afghans involved in it. But I think that may come across the frontier here. So concern about whether ISIS are actually here. I think you'll see the Afghan forces facing huge security challenges, and clearly the Taliban are going to try their hardest this summer to break them, to control ground, to hold parts of Helmand, for example, places on the frontier with Pakistan, continue their alliances with Haqqani and Hekmatyar and these other groups. And I think my guess is that they won't extend hugely, that the Afghan state will hold them off. The Afghan army is now good enough, not to lose the country. But there is this huge Achilles heel, which challenges the competence, the increasing competence of the Afghan armed forces, which is that the economy is completely shot.
Yeah, and this is what you were mentioning in one of your reports.
Governance, all of the growth has ground to a halt. It was a wartime bubble. It's hollowed out by the departure of the Americans. Maybe 80,000 people, at one estimate, were directly employed by the international community and now out of a job. So you're seeing, a country which is facing really big challenges for a poor country. And with a lack of momentum from its political class, and a lack of sense of that actually, we haven't got very long, because although international security money will continue, international aid money for other programs is clearly going to fall off rapidly. Congress already voted to cut US aid in half this year, and so I think there is one of the challenges that's really making people nervous. I mean, they're more nervous now than they were before the election last year, when there was a lot of nervousness around, but the hope and optimism. I mean, Afghanistan surprised itself by voting in the numbers that they did, and the atmosphere was extraordinary. It's like a carnival here in Kabul, and I was in Helmand for the second round of the presidential election, and again, stable and peaceful where I was. I mean, there were attempts to disrupt the election across the country, but and there was a lot of violence in some places, but it went ahead, and that gave the country an enormous sense of kind of hope and expectation. And a lot of those hopes have been dashed by people who frankly should know better. And we're not quite at the stage of detachment from reality that the Iraqi political class had, but it's quite similar. Individuals who go in and out of Dubai, who've got fat on the back of frankly, international aid money here over the years, and who the country deserves better of its politicians. I mean, it's got in its president the man who literally wrote the book on fixing failed states, who's, President Ghani is an economist, has advised other governments on fixing failed states, but actually, operating the levers of power in this system without political support has proved to be a really complicated task for him. And I think a lot of people are wishing that there was a bit more momentum on the domestic agenda and better communications, at least, as to how the government was doing.
Excellent sum up. One final question: when's your next book coming out? And
I'm working on some ideas on intervention and how we could get it better. And so, watch this space.
Yeah. Well, I'm a huge fan of your earlier works, and recommended it to all my students, and I will continue to recommend everything you do, because you've had your fingers on the pulse of that place since, my gosh, was it '94 or so? And,
yeah. Well, thank you, Jeff. You're too kind, and I appreciate your interest. And do keep recommending my book. That's important.
Absolutely. I told, because many of the students were going, oh boy, there's so many books around, and I go, well, if there's one book you can only have one book in your rucksack or packsack or whatever it is you've got, take David Loyn's, in Afghanistan, and that's been my request all along when they've looked for just the one book. So it's you really sum things up nicely. Okay, David. Well, we'll talk later. You know what? I'll send you a picture of that that now demised wolf of mine.
Oh, yeah. Oh, no, I'd like to see that. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sorry to hear that.
Yeah,
but
it was. It's amazing how they get under your skin. You don't think they do.
Sure.
They do.
Sure. Yeah. Well, that's why you have them.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
As a companion. Yeah. All right, Jeff. Thanks a lot.
All right. Cheers. Bye-bye.
See you then.